Hello everyone, I'm making this video to talk about Skyforge and to give you my thoughts, impressions, opinion, however you want to take it, about the game. Now I will try to keep this as short as possible. There's actually a lot to talk about, but I'll try not to get too deep into every separate topic. I may make other videos in the future about specific aspects of the game, but for now I'm going to try and give you a general overview of what the game is about, what you should expect if you want to play it and stuff like that. Okay, here's what it's about. It's an MMO with a rather unique gameplay as well as unique progression system. I've personally never played one such as that. On top of that, you can change between all the classes available outside of combat. So it proved very interesting for me to go through it and experience it. Now, I'm going to focus on 4 topics in this video. Topic number 1 will be the gameplay, topic number 2 will be the progression, topic number 3 will be the story and voice acting and things like that, and topic 4 will be the free-to-play versus subscription, how it works and what the differences are. So the gameplay. The combat is some sort of a mixture between several games I've had on this channel. It has a little bit of World of Warcraft and Star Wars The Old Republic, the traditional MMO with tap targeting, action bars and whatnot. It has a little bit of The Witcher's combat style with dodging and a hybrid targeting between using a crosshair and then locking onto a target. Well, The Witcher doesn't really have a crosshair, but it's similar to that. You can actually use both. You can sort of unlock from the target and continue using the crosshair, then lock again. And initially it's a little strange, initially it's a little weird. I found myself, when I started playing, not wanting to use the crosshair almost at all. I actually looked up for an option to switch it off completely, but when I got the hang of it, I think I enjoy it. I want to have both in different situations and switch between the two. Takes a little time to get used to. It also has an element from Dragon Age Inquisition where it does not have the holy trinity of MMOs, the tank, healer and DPS. Instead, here you got DPS, tank and support. So there is no dedicated healing class. Supports can shield, they can buff, they can give damage dealers more damage, but they cannot just take someone with low health and max him out. Another interesting thing is that the game has dodging, or rather it's called dashing. You have 3 dashes that recharge, and different classes dash in different ways. Some have improvements to their dash. For example, the Cryomancer has a longer dash, as well as leaving a trail behind him that slows. And this is primarily used to avoid damage in PvE or chase or run from people in PvP, and it adds a little bit of an action angle to the game. Now, couple that with the lack of healing, the game can be challenging, at least in a way that you have to take care of yourself when you're doing group content and solo as well. You have to be careful, you can't just power through the enemies, you have to see what they're doing, you have to avoid it, you have to take action. You can't just do like I do in World of Warcraft, play a rogue and get cheat death and hope that you'll get healed up when you don't die where you should die. Here you have to be much more careful and tactical in different situations. So generally I really like the gameplay, I really enjoyed it, I find it refreshing, I find it interesting, action-packed and whatnot. There is one thing though that I really dislike. It's a relatively minor thing that does not always come into play, but sometimes it can be frustrating, and that is that you get stuck in the most weird obstacles. Like there's a little rock on the ground that you can't go over, you have to jump over it, you can just move through, and what's worse, sometimes it will stop your dashes, so that's annoying. Good thing it doesn't happen in PvP, or at least I don't think there are such obstacles in PvP. And I think that's the only thing that stands out as negative. For the most part, the gameplay is really good. I'll get into the story later, but the story is definitely not the strongest point of this game. The mythos, however, is not bad. The setting is interesting. There's war between gods, or rather I should say war between immortals, who strive to become gods, who strive to be worshipped and whatnot. And there are elements of sci-fi, elements of fantasy, like for example you have advanced technology, starships and whatnot, and at the same time you have witches and necromancy and brooms and over-the-top stuff, like a giant cross between a greatsword and a chainsaw. That's the Berserker, and the other classes are I think a little more down to earth, but the Berserker is just wow. And the sound effects, the animations, beautiful. All of the classes have their own sound effects and animations for everything. All classes walk differently, move differently, carry their weapons differently, shoot differently, attack differently. Everything is unique and well done, and it's pleasant to watch. It pleases the eyes. Not to mention, the game has probably the best screenshot system that I've ever seen. You can literally pause at every moment and then adjust the camera, and not only that, we can actually adjust things like focus distance and sharpness and whatnot. It's amazing. Okay, now it's time to talk about the progression system, and boy is it extensive. Now, in this game you don't have levels, instead you have prestige. What is prestige? Well, it's like score, essentially. You can take it as score points, and there are so many ways in which you can increase that prestige. The most simple one is items and upgrading the items. You can get gear, and on top of that you can upgrade the gear slots. Another way, which is the most extensive one, is the Ascension Atlas. Now, if you've played Path of Exile, I've played it in the beta, there is something similar going on here. You don't have a talent tree, instead you have a giant web of nodes. And once you reach a certain point in your class development, you start with 3 classes, Cryomancer, Paladin, and Lightbringer. Reach a certain point in the development of any of those 3 classes, and you go out on the Ascension Atlas, this giant network, and you realize that the 3 classes are actually 3 nodes of this giant thing. And from there, you have to make your way to every single class in order to unlock it. And every node provides a certain bonus. It's usually passive stats. There are some active ones that give you an ability, which are called symbols, and these symbols have to be unlocked, but you're only able to equip them or to activate them as you max out separate classes. So for example, you max out one class, you get 2 symbols. You max out another class, you get another 2, and so on. Now, I don't know if I mentioned, but you can actually switch with one character between all of the classes. As soon as you unlock them, you get access to play with all of them. Now, you can't do it in combat. Well, technically, in a certain situation you can, but it's very limited, so let's assume you cannot do it in combat 99% of the time. You have to pick one and go in combat with it, and each of these classes have their own smaller, much smaller atlas. And by filling up that atlas, you're unlocking the different abilities and talents of this class, and finally, when you unlock everything, you get to use 2 more symbols, which are abilities, passive or active, mostly passive, like I've mentioned, that you unlock from the big Ascension Atlas. Now, on top of the Ascension Atlas, there are several more atlases that are not as big but are pretty big. Each of the, I believe it's 5 main enemy types, have their own atlas. Now, when you get to the end game, there are invasions, and during these invasions you can acquire specific sparks. Sparks are called the resource you use to unlock nodes in the atlas. Specific spark to increase your strength against specific enemies. But that's later on, and that's like, I suppose, less important. You also have the Divine Atlas. When you reach 30,000 prestige, you will unlock your Divine form, and you can do things there. But this one, the Ascension Atlas, is the main one. It has all the classes and all the symbols, and you'll spend a lot of time unlocking that. The third thing you can do is develop your order. Now, your order is something similar to your garrison in World of Warcraft. You don't exactly have a place where you build stuff, but you can recruit followers. These followers are not called followers, they're called your adepts. They basically spread your glory among the world or something, and you can send them to missions. They bring rewards. Every day they also leave gifts for you that you can collect, just like the garrison cache in World of Warcraft. Now, on top of that, you can build temples in certain places and assign these adepts to, I don't know, to curate the temples or something. And these temples provide passive benefits as well. And I think that's all I'm going to say about the orders, because I probably have to make separate videos about the Ascension Atlas, the order system and all that. And I suppose these are the most important ways. There are also other ways through the Pantheon system. Pantheon is basically the guild, but I'm not going to go more into it. In general, the character progression is extremely extensive. It is also rather complicated. There are so many resources, and I suppose the game does a good job of providing a good tutorial. Essentially, Until you get to the end game, the game is one big tutorial that slowly reveals itself to you and shows you what new stuff are available, what they're used for, and so on. So I guess the developers did a good job on that, but still there's so many different resources used for so many different things. If you take, for example, other MMOs, let's take Star Wars The Old Republic, what kind of resources do you have? What do you spend to get stuff? You have credits, the money, and you have PvE and PvP commendations. Each of them have like 3 or 4 or however many tiers, but they work the same way roughly. You know, you do solo content, you get commendation number 1. You do group content, depending on how hard it is, you get commendation type 2, 3 or 4. Similar with PvP, you know, ranked, unranked and whatever. Now let's take Skyforge. You have credits, you've got crystals, you've got 7, 8, how many types of enhancement stones. You have sparks of destruction, sparks of balance, sparks of creation, ether cores, sparks of mastery, sparks of transformations, spark replicators, sparks for every class, sparks of evolution, sparks of divinity, sparks of revelation, 2 types of resources for your order, you have gifts, you have holy text, you've got celestial threads. There's a million things, and it does get a little complicated, especially in the beginning, if you start wondering and looking up everything. But you will slowly begin to get what everything's for, and it's not all that complicated, but I admit they probably should have streamlined it a little bit, because it feels like a needless complexity sometimes. Now, ultimately, I like the character progression, and I think I will talk more about this when I get to the free-to-play versus subscription. So stay for that part, it will be the end of the video. I'm going to stop talking about progression now and talk about the story and voice acting and setting and all that. Alright, so that has got to be the worst part of the game. And I understand that the game is not really about the story. It's kind of like, I suppose a good example would be Path of Exile. You know, Path of Exile, you play it because of the character progression, you know, and the combat and the gameplay. You don't play it because of how exciting the story is. At least in the beta, there was hardly any story. Here, the focus of this game is similar, although, especially towards the beginning, you might get confused into thinking that it's more story-focused than it actually is, and that the story is a more important part than it actually is. And I think they tried to make it this way, but didn't really succeed. The setting and the world itself is interesting, and I like it. It's kind of weird, but in a good way. However, the story, it has mediocre moments at best. Most of it is just not interesting. The voice acting, there are a few characters that are reasonably good, but the majority are just plain bad. Not to mention that the animations during voice acting, the lips are synced to the Russian version.
We pushed deeper into the island, and suddenly ghostly hands started to emerge from the ground. They caught us off guard, and that's when Verd took the opportunity to attack. They killed most of our squad and dragged the survivors to their burrows. We had to fall back. Some of our men may have survived. Try to find them and
I suppose the Russian voice acting may actually be better. There is no way to try it out, or at least I don't know of a way. I wanted to try out Russian dialogue with English subtitles, but I couldn't get it. Out of all the characters that are being introduced, I guess I only enjoy talking to Flavius. And if you're looking for a game with an interesting, compelling plot, Skyforge is not for you. At some points, I just wish the quests were more like World of Warcraft, with just a bunch of text you can read if you want, and the voice acting would be just a couple of words and that's it. Because oftentimes I just find myself skipping the voice acting because it's not interesting. And also the dialogue, the way it's animated, you can tell, it's so obvious that the developers didn't focus on it, because the animations during gameplay, like I mentioned in the beginning, are so extensive. Every class has their own movement, their own everything unique. Movement, shooting, dodging, whatever. When it comes to the dialogue though, it feels like all the male characters who speak repeat the same motions over and over again. So a huge contrast there. That is probably my main complaint about the game. It feels as though the game tries to be story focused, but it fails. And with that said, let's go into the final section for this video, which will be the free-to-play versus subscription. I've looked up the internet, forums, Reddit and stuff like that, and There are varied opinions, and I suppose that's only natural. For my personal needs, this free-to-play system is good. Now, I have played as a subscriber for the most part. Obviously, the subscription is better because, well, duh, if the game doesn't entice you to be a subscriber or to pay money in any way, it's not doing a good job. If everyone can just be free to play, it won't be able to sustain itself. However, comparing it specifically, let's say, to Star Wars The Old Republic, because that's been the MMO that I've played the most recently, in Star Wars The Old Republic, if I lose subscription for a week, that's a week that I'm not going to play the game at all. And that's not because I'm spoiled or something, it's just because the things that I want to do right now in Star Wars The Old Republic are locked out from the free-to-play model. You can do the Knights of the Fallen Empire story, you can do operations, and there you go. Now, how does free-to-play work in Skyforge? It basically makes you progress slower. It depends on whether you have replicators or not, but for the most part, let's say it makes you progress anywhere between 50 and 100% slower. The different kind of sparks and credits are just dropping less than they would if you were a subscriber. Now, is that good or bad? Personally, I said that I like it because it does not restrict you from accessing any element of the game. The amount of PvP, PvE, the amount of gear you can access, the amount of abilities, just everything that a subscriber has access to, you have access to as free to play as well. And that's where a key difference with, say, Star Wars The Old Republic comes. Here, if I happen to lose subscription for a week, I won't be like, oh, I don't want to play anymore, it's not fun anymore. Sure, it gets slower, but if you enjoy playing the game, chances are you'll enjoy it still if you are free to play. I don't know if I must have mentioned that there are limits of resources you can get per week, credits, different kinds of sparks, and so on. So subscribers and free players have the same limit. And if you're free to play, provided that you play long enough, you can achieve the exact same thing as a subscriber would, only for a longer time. Now here's where a lot of people say that the game's a grind. They are free to play and they want to cap the limits. Now I admit that if you want to cap the limit for colored sparks as free player, you'll probably have to grind a lot. However, I don't think it's such a bad idea not to get that limit. To me, it seems that the more important thing you should do is cap your class sparks limit, not necessarily the color sparks. And the reason why is that I think class sparks enhance the gameplay the most because they allow you to level up the classes, and when you play with a fully unlocked class, you can get the full experience out of the class, obviously. They also unlock the symbols, which provide passive benefits to all the classes, and they just seem to provide the most value. And the limit for these sparks is much lower and much easier to get than the colored sparks. So in my book, as long as you're capping your class sparks, you're doing good progression. The color sparks, for the most part, just add stats to your character. They don't add real change or real difference. It's not like they're not important, but if you take, for example, the way scaling works in the game, when you use the group finder for both PvE or PvP, there is only upscaling. In other words, the game checks who's the highest prestige player and it scales the stats of all others up to his. And the difference at that point primarily comes from how developed your order is and how many classes you've unlocked and therefore access to how many symbols you have. And on top of that, there are things called spark replicators, which increase the amount of sparks that drop. And if you don't cap your limits for a certain time, they begin to increase, and when they increase over a certain point, these spark replicators go into some sort of overdrive mode. I think they call it, how do they call it? Catch-up mode or something like that, where they begin to give you a huge amount of bonus sparks. So eventually the game helps you catch up if you can't reach your limits. But overall, while I do prefer to be a subscriber, obviously, I don't think the free-to-play system is bad. Oh, and I forget to mention how things work in PvP. Well, there you get placed into leagues. So if you get ahead and you get stronger than the people you're playing with, you'll be transferred to a higher league with better players. So if you happen to go ahead of people, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will start wrecking everyone. So to sum up, Skyforge, you have an MMO with an interesting touch to gameplay, character progression, ability to change between different classes, lots of ways to develop the classes, decent PvE and PvP. The gameplay ultimately may not be for you, but you may like it. You'll have to try it out for yourself. You have subpar story and voice acting that should have and could have been better. Maybe it wasn't a smart business decision to make a better story and use better voice actors and whatnot, but I feel like that's a missed opportunity, and you might as well just skip it. And you have what's in my opinion a reasonably fair subscription system, which may turn into a grind if you choose to be free to play all the time, but if you are a subscriber, that's not really the case. So there you go, that was this rather long video, longer than I wished, and I might be making some more about it to focus a little more on different aspects. Tell me what you think about the game if you've played it. If you haven't, you can try it out. There's a link into the description. And also I've been thinking of live streaming it, so perhaps we could try a live stream, especially if someone else is playing for my viewers. So that was basically it. Thank you very much for watching, and until next video, stay tuned and be good.